This tall tale is titled Paul Bunyan by May Kennedy, illustrated by Alvaro Fernandez Villa.
Chapter 1. The Giant Baby. Long ago, in the state of Maine, a giant baby boy was born. When the baby was only 2 weeks old, he was as large as an adult, and he had a gigantic black bushy beard. The baby's name was Paul Bunyan. He grew and grew. By the time he was just 9 months old, he was 10 feet tall. He had to wear the clothes of an extremely large man. He wore blue jeans, a red plaid shirt, and huge leather boots. When baby Paul Bunyan started to crawl, it was as if an earthquake had struck. The ground shook, the buildings in the village wobbled, and the trees in the forest rocked from side to side. The shaking ground frightened the townsfolk. They crouched inside doorways and dived under tables, staying like that until the shaking subsided. Of course, the shaking hardly ever stopped. Babies like to explore their surroundings, and Paul Bunyan was no exception. The unhappy townsfolk demanded that Paul Bunyan's parents do something about their baby. His parents reluctantly placed their beloved boy in a huge floating cradle, and then pushed the cradle off the coast of Maine. "Farewell," called Paul Bunyan's mother, crying as she waved goodbye. However, the situation soon grew worse. When baby Paul turned in his cradle, gigantic waves crashed along the beaches and flooded entire towns. Then the cradle washed back to shore. Paul Bunyan's parents were desperate. They took baby Paul deep into the Maine woods and left him in the safety of a cave, far away from civilization. They did not want to abandon their son, but they had no alternative. Paul Bunyan's father gave his son a knife, an axe, a fishing pole, and some flint rocks to help him survive in the wilderness. His mother tried to be brave as she said farewell to her precious son. Baby Paul was heartbroken. He wept so much that a river of tears formed at his feet. One day, as he cried into the winding river, he heard a splash. "It's a trout!" he exclaimed. He quickly grabbed his fishing pole and captured the trout. He used his knife to clean the fish. Then he used his axe to chop firewood and the flint rocks to start a fire. Soon Paul was eating a delicious meal, and his heavy heart felt much lighter. Chapter 2. A World of Blue. Now Paul Bunyan knew that he could live comfortably in the Maine woods. He could take care of himself by fishing and hunting for food. Trees were plentiful in the enormous woods, so there was always lumber for making fires, which allowed him to cook and to keep warm. Paul Bunyan lived alone for the next 20 years. He had to be very brave. He had to battle against the harsh seasons to survive. The winters were extreme, with ferocious snowstorms and blizzards. There were many floods in the spring. He had to fight forest fires, which were lit by lightning during the summer thunderstorms. He had to wrestle the wild whipping winds of fall. On one particularly cold winter's day, Paul Bunyan's life changed forever. Great gusts of snow fell into the entrance of his cave, but the snow was not white. It was blue. Paul Bunyan had never seen anything like it. He peered out of his cave. The blue snow had blanketed the trees and land as far as he could see. "It is absolutely beautiful," he exclaimed. "It is the color of a magnificent blue lake." Paul Bunyan was extremely curious. Dressed in his warmest clothes and boots, he sauntered across the blue, snow-covered land. Lightning zapped and thunder clapped in the wintry skies above him. Suddenly, a wild westerly wind whistled past Paul Bunyan. The wind and the thunder were so deafening that they almost drowned out a faint "ma, ma" sound. Paul Bunyan looked around. He tried to find out what was making the noise. All he could hear was the thunder and wind. Then he noticed a tail poking out of the blue snow. He pulled and pulled on the tail. Finally, out popped the biggest baby ox on earth, and that is no exaggeration. The baby ox was blue, like the surrounding snow, but its horns were the color of delicate white snowflakes. Paul Bunyan crouched on the icy ground beside the baby ox. He gently scooped up the ox in his cradling arms and carried it back to his cave. Once inside, he carefully placed the baby ox on the ground. He put more wood on the crackling fire to thaw the frozen animal. "You will be safe here in my cozy cave," Paul told the frightened creature. Curled up by the fire, the ox looked like a sleeping child posed for a painting. By morning, the ox was stronger and happier. At last, Paul Bunyan had a friend. He named his friend Babe the Blue Ox. Babe was much like Paul in that he grew very rapidly. When Babe was a full-grown ox, he was the staggering height of 42 axe handles. Babe's hunger and thirst became greater as he grew bigger, and this was a problem. Paul needed a watering hole big enough for Babe's thirst, so he took a few giant strides west and dug gigantic ponds in the ground. Today, we call Babe's enormous watering holes the Great Lakes. Chapter 3. The Giant Lumberjack. Paul Bunyan and Babe enjoyed wandering through the woods and admiring the trees. Paul Bunyan knew, though, that people needed these trees to build homes, barns, and wagons, so he picked up his axe and gave it a mighty swing. In the blink of an eye, 10 white pines plunged to the forest floor. Then, one after another, he brought more impressive pines crashing down. Babe looked puzzled. "We must get this lumber to a sawmill," explained Paul Bunyan to his friend. The giant lumberjack stacked the trees onto Babe's colossal back. The closest sawmill was by the Big Onion River in Minnesota. Paul and Babe left Maine. They commenced their journey, taking the most enormous steps that you can imagine. Along the way, Paul Bunyan saw a river and thought that the logs would travel well on it. But with all the twists and turns in the river, he knew that the logs would jam along their watery route.